They say the scent of Wisteria is the scent of a memory you can never quite outrun. In the village of Oakhaven, the purple blooms drip from the stone walls of Croft Hall like weeping silk, a beautiful, suffocating reminder of the spring the world ended. It is a story of a girl with dirt beneath her fingernails and a boy with a crown of expectations, and the single, devastating lie that sent her across the Atlantic to become something neither of them ever imagined. If you've ever wondered if a heart can truly heal after being shattered for its own good, then stay close. This is a tale of cold duty, a widow's vengeance, and the fire that refuses to die. Before we begin this journey into the shadows of the English countryside, please subscribe and like this video. Tell me in the comments, could you ever forgive someone who broke your heart just to save your life? Chapter 1. The Lavender Lie. The wisteria was in full mocking bloom the day Jonathan Croft killed the only part of himself that felt alive. The scent was everywhere, cloying, sweet and heavy, clinging to the humid air of the gardens like a funeral shroud. For Jonathan, the heir to the earldom of Ashworth, the gardens had always been a sanctuary, mostly because they were the domain of Mr. Dawson, the head gardener, and more importantly, his daughter, Caroline. But today, the sanctuary was a scaffold. "I don't understand, Jonathan," Caroline whispered. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive stone manor, her simple muslin dress damp from the morning mist. Her hair, a wild halo of chestnut curls that always defied the neat pins she tried to tame them with, was beginning to frizz. To Jonathan, she was the most beautiful thing in England. To the rest of the world, she was a servant's daughter who had forgotten her place. Jonathan didn't look at her. If he looked at her, really looked into those wide, amber eyes, he would break. He would drop to his knees, beg her for a forgiveness he didn't deserve, and they would both be ruined by nightfall. "It is quite simple, Caroline," he said, his voice sounding like dry parchment. He had spent the entire night practicing this coldness, honing it into a blade. "The season is beginning. My father has made it clear that my presence is required in London, and more importantly, my focus must be on the future of this estate. And I am not part of that focus." She stepped toward him, the smell of damp earth and lavender trailing after her. She reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his fine wool coat. "You said, last week, under the willow, you said you didn't care about the title. You said we would find a way." He flinched as if burned. "I was a boy indulging in a summer fantasy, Caroline, a pleasant distraction from the weight of my studies. But a man of my standing cannot marry a fantasy. He must marry a dowry." The silence that followed was sharper than any scream. He finally forced himself to look at her. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking ghostly against the vibrant purple vines. "A distraction?" she repeated, her voice trembling. 7 years of friendship, 2 years of everything we shared, and I am a distraction?" "Precisely," he said, reaching into his pocket. His hand shook, so he shoved it deeper, pulling out a small, stiff envelope. He didn't tell her that an hour ago his father, the Earl, had sat him down in a study that smelled of stale brandy and decay. He didn't tell her that his father had shown him the ledgers, the mountains of debt, the gambling losses that had bled the estate dry. Most importantly, he didn't tell her the ultimatum. "Either you marry an heiress and send that gardener's brat packing, or I will turn her father out of his cottage today. I will ensure no estate from here to the Scottish border ever hires a Dawson again. They will starve in the hedgerows, Jonathan. Is that the love you have for her?" Jonathan held out the envelope. "There is a ticket inside, a passage on the Caledonia. It sails from Liverpool in 3 days, for New York." Caroline stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "New York? You are sending me to America?" "It is for the best. You have an aunt in Manhattan, do you not? My father has provided a small sum to see you settled. It is more than enough for a girl of your station to start over. Perhaps find a husband who is more suited to your temperament." "You are a coward," she said, her voice suddenly losing its tremble. It went flat, hard as flint. "You don't even have the courage to look me in the eye and admit you're afraid of your father." "I am not afraid," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "I am bored, Caroline, bored of the secrets, bored of the dirt, and bored of you. Take the ticket. If you are found on the estate by sunset, my father's constables will remove you and your father by force." He turned his back on her then. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than the wars he would later read about, harder than the slow rot of the years that followed. He listened to the sound of her footsteps retreating, the crunch of gravel beneath her sensible shoes, and then the sound of a muffled sob that seemed to tear the very air apart. He stood there under the wisteria until the sun went down, clutching a single purple bloom in his hand until his knuckles turned white and the petals were crushed into a bruised, fragrant paste. The crossing to New York was a nightmare of grey waves and sickness, but Caroline Dawson did not die. She sat on the deck of the Caledonia, staring at the horizon until her eyes burned, the ticket Jonathan had bought her tucked into her corset like a shard of glass against her heart. She arrived in the New World with nothing but a trunk of old clothes and a rage so cold it kept her warm in the bitter Manhattan winters. Her aunt's home turned out to be a cramped tenement, but Caroline didn't care. She went to work. She started as a seamstress, her fingers bleeding as she stitched silk for women who had never known a day of hunger. But she was smart, sharper than the men who tried to cheat her. She taught herself the books, the trade routes, the way money moved like water through the city. It was there, in the bustling offices of a shipping firm, that she met Silas Vance. He was 30 years her senior, a titan of the seas with a heart of gold and a body failing him. He didn't want a trophy, he wanted a partner. He saw the steel in Caroline's eyes and the way she could calculate a cargo's value faster than his best clerks. "You're running from something, Red," he'd said to her, using his nickname for her chestnut fare. "I'm not running any more, Mr. Vance," she had replied, looking at the map of the world on his wall. "I'm waiting." They married a year later. It was a marriage of profound respect and genuine affection. He gave her his name, his wealth, and the education of a queen, and when he passed away 5 years later, he left her everything. Now, 7 years after a boy under a wisteria tree told her she was a distraction, Caroline Vance stood on the deck of a private steamer, watching the white cliffs of Dover rise out of the mist. She was no longer a gardener's daughter in muslin. She was the steel widow of Manhattan, and she had come back to England not for an apology, but for an accounting. The Croft estate was failing. She knew this because she had spent the last 2 years quietly buying up every debt, every mortgage, and every note signed by the Earl of Ashworth. She looked down at her hands, now gloved in the finest kidskin. The dirt was gone, but the memory of the wisteria remained. "The season is beginning, Jonathan," she whispered to the wind. "And this time, I'm the one who's written the ending." The air at Croft Hall was thick with the scent of 1,000 blooming wisteria vines, a fragrance that Jonathan Croft had come to loathe with a visceral, quiet intensity. To the ton, gathered in their finery, it was the smell of the social event of the year. To Jonathan, it was the smell of a ghost. He stood on the stone terrace, his hand resting stiffly on the railing, looking out over the sea of lilac-colored lanterns that mirrored the hanging blossoms. Beside him stood Lady Honoria Spencer. She was, by all accounts, a triumph of English breeding, pale, poised, and utterly devoid of any warmth that might accidentally spark a flame. Her father, the Duke of Averley, stood a few paces away, nursing a glass of sherry and watching Jonathan with the calculating gaze of a man who had just purchased a particularly fine piece of livestock. "The gardens are quite adequate this year, Lord Jonathan," Honoria said, her voice like a cool stream over flat stones, "though I do think the purple is a bit overwhelming. Perhaps next year, when we are settled, we might replace some of these old vines with something more structured. White roses, perhaps." Replace the wisteria. The thought should have pleased him. It was the living monument to his greatest sin, and yet the idea of ripping it out felt like a second execution. "The vines have been here for a century, Lady Honoria," Jonathan replied, his voice a practiced monotone. "They are resilient." "Even resilience must give way to progress," she said, tapping her fan against her wrist. Jonathan adjusted his cravat, feeling the silk tighten around his throat like a noose. Tonight was the night. His father, the Earl, had spent the evening hovering like a vulture, his eyes silently demanding the proposal that would secure the Averley fortune and save Croft Hall from the auction block. Jonathan had his speech prepared. It was a masterpiece of clinical efficiency, a cold offer of marriage to a cold woman to save a cold house. But then the sound of the evening shifted. It wasn't the orchestra, which was currently soaring through a lively quadrille. It was the sound of gravel, the heavy rhythmic crunch of a carriage approaching the main drive. But this wasn't the light, polite rattle of a London brougham. This sounded like the approach of an engine of war. The guests on the terrace began to murmur, parting like the Red Sea. A carriage emerged from the shadows of the long tree-lined drive. It was made of polished black lacquer, so dark and reflective it looked like a hole cut into the night. There was no family crest on the door, only a small, discreet flag of the United States. "An American," the Earl of Ashworth hissed, stepping up beside his son. "Who invited a colonial to a private ball?" Jonathan didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart, which he had spent 7 years convincing himself was a hollow organ, gave a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. The carriage door was opened by a footman in livery so sharp it put the Croft servants to shame. A woman stepped out. The collective breath of the ton seemed to catch in a single, audible gasp. She was not wearing the modest pastel lace or the heavy brocades favored by the English ladies. Her gown was a scandalous, breathtaking column of shimmering silver silk that clung to her curves like moonlight on water. It had no bustle, no fuss, only the liquid grace of expert tailoring. And her hair, that wild chestnut hair, was not piled into a rigid fortress of pins. It was swept back in a loose, elegant style that allowed soft, rebellious curls to frame a face that Jonathan saw every time he closed his eyes. Caroline. She stood at the base of the stairs, her head held high, a diamond choker at her throat that could have bought half the county. She didn't look like a gardener's daughter. She looked like a conqueror. As she began her ascent up the stone steps, the crowd fell into a hushed, judgmental silence. She didn't falter, she didn't look for approval. Her gaze swept over the crowd with the cool indifference of a queen surveying her subjects. And then her eyes found his. The impact was physical. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. The 7 years of silence, the letters he'd never sent, the whiskey he'd drunk to forget the shape of her smile, it all collapsed into the space between them. The scent of the wisteria suddenly changed. It was no longer the smell of a funeral. It was the smell of that final morning, the smell of her skin, the smell of his regret. "Jonathan," Lady Honoria said, her voice sharp with irritation, "who is that woman? She's staring quite pointedly." Jonathan didn't hear her. He was watching Caroline reach the top of the stairs. She stopped 10 feet away, the silver of her dress catching the glow of the lanterns. Up close, he could see the change. The softness of the girl was gone, replaced by a sharp, luminous beauty that felt dangerous. Her eyes, once warm like honey, were now hard and bright as amber set in gold. She didn't wait to be introduced. She didn't wait for permission to speak. "Lord Jonathan," she said. Her voice had changed too. The lilt of the English countryside was still there, but it was tempered by a New York edge, a confidence that was entirely foreign to the drawing-rooms of Oakhaven. "I see the gardens haven't changed, though I suspect the soil is a bit more depleted than it used to be." Jonathan's father stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and rage. "See here, madam, this is a private function. I don't believe you are on the guest list." Caroline turned her gaze to the Earl. It was a look of such profound, icy recognition that the older man actually took a half-step back. "Oh, I believe I am exactly where I am supposed to be, my lord," she said softly. "I am Caroline Vance, and I've come to see if the Croft legacy is as grand as I remembered, or if it's merely held together by old vines and even older lies." Jonathan felt the world tilting. He had been prepared to marry for duty. He had been prepared to live a life of quiet, grey desperation. But as Caroline stood there, draped in silver and defiance, the statue he had become began to crack. The ice he had spent years freezing around his heart didn't just melt, it shattered. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Arbours. The orchestra struck the first notes of a waltz, a daring, swirling melody that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the room. In the polite society of Oakhaven, the waltz was still a thing of breathless scandal, a dance that required a proximity that made chaperones flutter their fans in distress. Caroline stood at the edge of the terrace, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, watching the ton with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying species. She felt their eyes like needle pricks, the sneers of the dowagers, the hungry gazes of the younger sons who smelt the American gold she radiated. She was waiting for him. She knew he couldn't stay away. When the shadow fell over her, she didn't turn. She knew the scent of him even after a decade, sandalwood and the crisp, cold air of the moors. "You are creating a scene, Caroline." Jonathan's voice was a low growl near her ear. "I have spent 7 years learning how to create scenes, Jonathan. They are much more effective than making requests." She finally turned, her silver silk skirts shimmering as they brushed against his evening trousers. "And you are staring. Lady Honoria looks as though she might like to have me transported." "She is not the only one," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed him. They were roaming her face, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her throat, as if he were a starving man looking at a feast. I believe this dance is mine." "Is it? I don't recall seeing your name on my card. In fact, I don't recall having a card at all." He didn't wait for an answer. He took the champagne glass from her hand, set it on a passing waiter's tray, and stepped into her space. It was an invasion. He placed his hand at the small of her back, exactly where the silk was thinnest, and led her toward the center of the terrace. The music took them. To the onlookers, it was a display of aristocratic grace. To Jonathan and Caroline, it was a collision. Every time their bodies neared, the air seemed to hum with the static of 7 years of unsaid words. Jonathan held her with a grip that was just a fraction too tight, his thumb grazing the bare skin above her glove. "I see the new world has made you bold, Caroline," he whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "And I see the old world has made you a statue, Jonathan," she shot back, her amber eyes locking onto his. "Tell me, do you ever tire of it, playing the part they wrote for you, the dutiful son, the perfect earl-in-waiting, the man who sacrifices everything for a pile of crumbling stones?" "I did what I had to do to protect what matters," he said, his jaw tight. "You protected a title. You didn't protect me." The waltz spun them faster, the world blurring into a kaleidoscope of purple wisteria and white faces. The anger between them was a living thing, a fire that had been smoldering beneath the ice for a lifetime. "You look different," he said, his voice dropping to a vulnerable register that nearly broke her composure. "I am different. I am the woman who owns a fleet of ships and more liquid capital than your father has ever seen in his life. I am no longer the girl who cried in your garden, Jonathan. I am the woman who bought the garden." The music reached a crescendo. Before the final notes could fade, Jonathan didn't lead her back to the safety of the crowd. Instead, he pulled her toward the stone steps that led down into the dark arched tunnels of the Wisteria walk. They moved into the shadows, where the lanterns were mere pinpricks of light, and the scent of the flowers was thick enough to taste. Here, the air was cooler, damp with the evening dew, but the heat between them was suffocating. He stopped abruptly, swinging her around until her back hit the rough, vine-covered wood of a trellis. The purple blooms rained down on them like soft, fragrant confetti. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his hands framing her head, pinning her to the spot. "To mock me? To show me what I threw away? If you wanted to ruin me, you could have done it from New York." "I wanted to see the look on your face," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the solid weight of him, the familiar strength of his shoulders. She hated him for how much she still wanted to lean into him. "I wanted to see if you were still human, or if you had finally turned entirely to stone." "I am not stone," he rasped. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. The "I hate you" and the "I've been dying without you" were so tangled in the air they were indistinguishable. He looked at her lips, and for a second the mask of the English lord fell away completely. There was only the boy who had loved her, and the man who had lost her, caught in a moment of agonizing yearning that threatened to burn the entire estate to the ground. "You should leave," he whispered, even as his hand moved to cup her cheek, "before I forget that I have a soul to save." "Maybe I didn't come back to save your soul, Jonathan," she replied, her voice a sharp silver blade in the darkness. "Maybe I came back to own it." Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Debt. The darkness of the Wisteria tunnel was absolute, save for the slivers of moonlight that filtered through the heavy, drooping clusters of purple. Jonathan's hand remained on her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip with a desperation that spoke of a man drowning. For a heartbeat, the steel widow flickered. The silver silk felt too thin, her skin too sensitive, and the ghost of the girl who had loved him beneath these very vines screamed to be heard. But Caroline Vance had not crossed an ocean to be a girl again. She reached into the hidden pocket of her gown, a clever American edition that no London seamstress would have dared, and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. She pressed it against his chest, breaking the spell. "Is this a list of my sins, Caroline?" Jonathan rasped, his hand dropping away as he took the folder. "Because I assure you, I have them memorized." "It is a list of your debts, Jonathan, though in this case they are one and the same." He frowned, the shadows deepening the hollows of his face. He stepped back, moving toward a stone plinth where a flickering lantern sat. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first few pages. At first his expression was of confusion, but as he turned the leaves, his face went ashen. "These are private ledgers," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The Croft mortgages, the gambling vows my father signed in '32, the interest rates on the northern tenant farms. How did you get these? These were held by the London Exchange." "They were held by a consortium of creditors," Caroline said, her voice steady and cold. "But debt is a commodity, Jonathan, and like any commodity, it has a price. I spent 3 years tracking every shilling your father bled. I bought them, one by one, from the smallest tailor's bill to the massive lien on the hall itself." Jonathan's head snapped up. "You? Why, to humiliate us? To watch us be evicted as my father once threatened to do to yours?" "Look at the signatures on the transfers, Jonathan," she commanded, stepping into the light. "Don't look at who sold them to me. Look at who held them for the last 7 years. Look at the names behind the holding companies." He turned the pages frantically, his eyes widened. "Averley? The Duke of Averley? The man standing on your terrace right now, the man whose daughter you were about to pledge your life to," Caroline said, her words hitting like hammer blows. "The Duke didn't just offer to save you, Jonathan. He spent a decade meticulously orchestrating your father's bankruptcy. He bought your father's gambling debts from every club in St. James. He manipulated the grain prices on your tenant lands. He bled you dry until you had no choice but to crawl to him and offer him the one thing he wanted, the Croft title to bolster his own fading lineage." Jonathan stumbled back, his legs hitting a stone bench. He looked at the ledgers as if they were a nest of vipers. "My father, he thought he was a failure. He thought he'd lost everything to his own weakness. He lived in shame for years, died in it. He was a victim of a very long, very patient game," Caroline said, her voice softening just a fraction. "The Duke didn't want your friendship. He wanted your submission. He wanted to own the Croft scion." The silence in the tunnel was heavy. The distant music of the ball seemed like a grotesque mockery now. Jonathan looked down at his hands, the hands that had been prepared to sign a marriage contract that was nothing more than a bill of sale. "And now?" Jonathan asked, his voice hollow. "If the Duke doesn't own us, you do." Caroline stepped closer, the shimmering silver of her dress catching the lantern light. She looked like a vengeful angel of the moors. "Yes, I own every acre of this land. I own the Wisteria. I own the stone beneath your feet. I own the very bed you sleep in." "So, what is the price of my freedom, Caroline?" he asked, his eyes burning with a mixture of shame and a terrifying rekindled hope. "What does the Steel Widow want in exchange for my life?" "I didn't come back to buy a husband, Jonathan," she whispered, her face inches from his. "I came back to see if there was anything left of the man I loved, or if he had truly become the Duke's puppet. I've destroyed the men who forced us apart. The question is, what are you going to do with the wreckage?" Jonathan looked from the papers to the woman standing before him, the woman he had sent away in a fit of cowardly protection, only for her to return as his savior and his master. The power had shifted. The duty that had been his prison was gone, replaced by a truth that burned brighter than any lantern. "I'm going to end the play," he said, his voice suddenly hard and certain. Chapter 5. A New Bloom. The ballroom was a shimmering cage of gold leaf and forced smiles when Jonathan re-entered, Caroline at his side. He did not lead her as a guest, he walked with her as an equal, his stride possessed of a terrifying new-found clarity. The music faltered as they approached the center of the room, the whispers dying down into a suffocating silence. The Earl of Ashworth stood with the Duke of Averley and Lady Honoria near the grand fireplace. Seeing his son return with the American widow, the Earl's face turned a mottled purple. "Jonathan," the Earl hissed, stepping forward, "enough of this madness. The Duke is waiting. Honoria is waiting. It is time for the announcement." Jonathan looked at his father, the man who had lived in the shadow of debt for so long he had forgotten the light of integrity. Then he looked at the Duke, whose thin, triumphant smile was the very image of the predator Caroline had described. "You are right, father," Jonathan said, his voice ringing out with a resonance that silenced the entire assembly. "It is time for an announcement, but it is not the one you have planned." He turned to the Duke of Averley. "Your Grace, I have spent years believing I owed you the survival of my family name. I believed your daughter's dowry was the only thing standing between us and the workhouse, but it seems I was mistaken about the nature of our relationship." Jonathan reached into his coat and produced the ledger. He didn't hand it over, he held it up for the room to see. "I have spent the last hour learning how you spent a decade systematically dismantling my family's security, how you bought our debts to force a union that would serve your vanity. You did not come to save Croft Hall, you came to feast on its remains." A collective gasp rippled through the ton. Lady Honoria's fan snapped shut with a sound like a pistol shot. "Jonathan, be silent," the Earl roared, but Jonathan ignored him.
"The engagement is ended," Jonathan declared, his gaze level. "I will not marry a debt, and I will not be a pawn in a game of chess played by a man I no longer respect. As for the debts of this estate," he turned to Caroline, his eyes softening into something raw and humble, "they have been settled by a creditor who understands the value of Croft Hall far better than you ever did." He took Caroline's hand, lifting it for all to see. "I would like to introduce you all to the new owner of Croft Hall, Mrs. Caroline Vance. She holds the deeds, the mortgages, and every stone of this valley. If you wish to remain in this house tonight, I suggest you pay your respects to her." The humiliation of the Duke and the Earl was absolute. Within minutes, the social event of the year began to disintegrate as the elite scrambled to flee the scandal. But Jonathan didn't watch them leave. He was looking only at Caroline. When the room was finally empty of everyone but the ghosts of their past, Jonathan turned to her. He didn't stand tall with ducal pride. He bowed his head. "I was a coward 7 years ago. he whispered, the silence of the ballroom heavy around them. "I thought I was saving you from poverty, but I was only saving myself from a fight. You have returned with a kingdom, Caroline, and I am a man with nothing but a title I don't deserve." "I didn't buy this house to make you a beggar, Jonathan," she said, her voice trembling with the first signs of real emotion. "I know," he replied. He looked up, his eyes shining. "But I am asking to stay, not as the Earl, but as your manager, as your servant, as whatever you will have me. I don't want the power anymore. I just want the girl who used to dream under the wisteria."
Caroline reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched his lapel. "The girl is gone, Jonathan. She died on that ship." "Then let me love the woman who survived," he vowed. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the mercy you've shown this house." He sank to one knee, not for a queen and not for a contract, but for the woman who had turned his cold world back into a garden. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the lilac wisteria in shades of bruised gold, the two of them stood on the terrace once more. The air was finally clear, the weight of a decade lifted. Croft Hall was no longer a prison of tradition or a trophy for a predator. It was a sanctuary of their own making. True love does not always come in the form of a fairy tale. Sometimes it comes in the form of fire. A fire that burns away the lies and the debts until only the truth remains. As Jonathan pulled Caroline into his arms, the scent of the wisteria was no longer a memory of loss. It was the fragrance of a new beginning, a bloom that would never fade, rooted in a soil that was finally truly free. I hope you enjoyed this journey of redemption and yearning.